One of the most successful, organised and violent bootleggers of the Prohibition era, Charles "VANNIE" Higgins is a mobster you may not have heard of, but certainly one whose story is worth remembering. VANNIE Higgins transformed Long Island into his own major bootlegging operation and flooded New York during the dry era with high-quality beer, whiskey and gin. With a savvy business brain and a lust for violence, VANNIE would not hesitate to murder anyone who tried to muscle in on his territory, spilling more blood in Brooklyn than ever before and earning him the moniker in the Brooklyn press as the bootleg king of the borough. VANNIE was a colourful character who was a journalist's dream, dressing in expensive imported British suits and being driven around in various limousines. Although almost always surrounded by bodyguards, VANNIE was known for his recklessness in street battles, and his offices and residences were well stocked with arsenals big enough to go to war with small countries. VANNIE was the first gangster to use hand grenades in New York in a series of vicious attacks against rivals Dutch Schultz and terrible Tommy Connell, and VANNIE was feared across New York by his bootlegging rivals, but respected in the press and amongst New York's elite. It wasn't just gang war that VANNIE was pioneering the use of new weapons in either. Unlike the unorganised bootleggers selling gut-rot cheap booze to down-and-outs in dirty, violent speakeasies, VANNIE would use state-of-the-art speedboats, including one called the Cigarette, which was described at the time as the quickest boat in New York waters. He would also pilot his own planes to smuggle his high-quality whiskey from Canada to the uptown clubs and aristocrats of the Big Apple. At one point, it was no exaggeration to say that VANNIE had the whole of Long Island and pretty much every cop in New York on his payroll, who all turned a blind eye to his modern methods of rum running and his lack of hesitation to use firepower to win bloody battles. This is the story of how a teenage pickpocket who was dragged up in the tenement buildings of Bay Ridge rose through the New York underworld and provided the highest quality illegal booze to the upper echelons of society, using the most innovative methods for war and rum running the streets of New York had ever seen. This is the story of Charles "VANNIE" Higgins. VANNIE Higgins was born Charles Van Wyck Higgins in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn in 1897. The fourth child of Daniel Higgins and Helen McCarthy, two Irish immigrants who had settled in Brooklyn about 7 years earlier after sailing over from Limerick, Ireland. With Ireland still recovering from the Great Famine 40 years earlier and the lack of employment still rife, this drove nearly a quarter of Ireland's population, around 6 million people, to leave the Emerald Isle towards the end of the 19th century and head to the States in pursuit of a better life. Daniel and Helen were both just 16 years old when they sailed from Liverpool on the Cunard Line to New York in 1890. Gazing at the Liverpool cityscape as it slowly drifted away from view, the young couple were excited to start their new life in America with a heart full of dreams and ambitions like many of their fellow Irish immigrants. 5 days later, the young couple disembarked at Ellis Island, the busiest immigrant inspection and processing station in the United States at the time, and awaited their sorting. Once they were through the invasive and cattle-like inspection delivered by the guards of Ellis Island, most Irish immigrants headed to New York, which was the closest city to the port, and Daniel and Helen were no different. After leaving Ellis Island with a bag full of clothes, some pictures of home, and not much else, the couple secured lodgings at 8414 4th Avenue, a tenement building in Bay Ridge, a small neighbourhood in the southwest corner of Brooklyn. A few days after their boots had hit the horse manure-soaked cobbled streets of New York, Daniel and Helen quickly realised what they had left behind in Limerick was a paradise. Compared to the clean-aired rolling green hills of Ireland, the living conditions in the prison-like, narrow, cramped tenement building they were now living in was nothing short of appalling. The Irish immigrants that flocked here were under the impression that New York was supposed to be a forward-thinking city, a city with the tallest buildings that offered employment in abundance, the best public health facilities in the world, and where dreams came true. In reality, this was a city that failed to provide proper housing, safety, or hygienic conditions for over 2/3 of its population. Except for the prospect of employment, something that was scarce in Ireland, New York was far worse for many Irish immigrants who made the leap. Upon arrival, they often face hostility from Americans biased against newcomers. Once they secured residency, typically in crowded tenement buildings, of which 8414 4th Avenue was definitely one of, they were confronted with severe overcrowding, limited access to water and hygiene facilities, and frequent outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhus. Families of 10 to 15 people were crammed into 2 small rooms, one serving as a kitchen and the other as a bedroom. By the turn of the century, more than 2/3 of the population lived in such conditions in around 80,000 largely unregulated tenement buildings across New York. Organised crime flourished, and in 1890, Jacob Riis documented the appalling living conditions at the time in How the Other Half Lives, a pioneering work of photojournalism that captured the squalid living conditions that many immigrants like Daniel and Helen were enduring at the time. How the Other Half Lives caught the attention of New York City Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt. However, the call for improving immigrant lives was slow to be acted on. Issues such as child labour, forced prostitution, and economic exploitation persisted for decades. Despite these grimy conditions, Daniel quickly found work as a feeder and pressman for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a local newspaper which his 4th child would grace the front pages of on a near daily basis. Helen, now pregnant with the couple's first child, stayed at home trying to provide some sanitary conditions for the family, and in 1891, she gave birth to a girl they named Sarah. Around 6 months after Sarah's birth, Daniel and Helen were married by Reverend John Tanzer at St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church a few blocks away at 9511 4th Avenue in Bay Ridge. Like most good Catholic families of the day, the Higginses continued to multiply, welcoming another daughter called Mary, born in 1894. The couple's first son was Thomas in 1895, and our man, Charles Van Wyck Higgins, took his first breath on the 4th of November 1897. It seems that Charles was named after Charles Henry Van Wyck, a prominent representative from New York, senator from Nebraska, and a Union Army brigadier general in the American Civil War. Van Wyck passed away in 1896, a year before Charles was born, and it's thought that Daniel named Charles after Van Wyck in his honour. Interestingly, Charles Van Wyck survived an assassination attempt during an anti-slavery speech in 1860, and our Charles would also survive his fair share throughout his life. Over the next 7 years, the Higginses would welcome another 3 sons, Daniel, Edward and John, into the world, and now Daniel Sr.'s weekly wage as a pressman was extremely stretched, with 7 hungry mouths to feed, not including Helen's and his own, and they lived on the breadline, as many immigrant families did at the time. This poverty-ridden upbringing led to Charles getting into trouble when he began exploring the streets of Bay Ridge and what they had to offer. In 1906, at the age of 9, Charles was arrested for stealing from a fruit stall, probably driven to thieve by hunger, but released shortly after, avoiding being sent to a Catholic protectorate due to a lack of witnesses. This was the first of what would be an extensive police record for young Charles. Hating the name Charles Van Wyck Higgins, he extended his middle name and stated his name to police as VANNIE Higgins, and the name stuck. VANNIE continued thieving his way around Bay Ridge to make ends meet, and formed a street corner gang with fellow adolescent hoodlums Bad Bill Bailey and Bob Benson. The 3 made a formidable trio and became expert pickpockets, using their spoils to expand their ranks and increase their manpower. As the teenage gang became stronger, they moved up the criminal ladder from petty theft to organised robbery, targeting shops and apartments in Bay Ridge after dark. By 1916, Vannie had racked up numerous charges for assault, robbery and grand larceny, but was put on probation, always avoiding jail time. Heading up the Higgins gang, as they were now being referred to in the press, the crew made their crust as a professional robbery outfit, eventually graduating from shops and apartments to hitting warehouses and stores, targeting furs, silks, jewellery and other valuables. This line of work led Vannie to first meet Jack Legs Diamond, a fellow thief who would be an ally and a good friend of Vannie's throughout his life. Legs had his own mob, the Diamond Gang, who were also hitting lofts and warehouses, and the factions began doing bigger jobs together, including banks and shipment yards. The two outfits were not afraid to use violence and firepower, and began rising through the ranks of the New York underworld, gaining a reputation of a feared and respected robbery gang as 1920 was welcomed in, which would provide both Vannie and Legs with an even more lucrative opportunity. On January the 17th, 1920, the 18th Amendment was passed, also known as Prohibition. This prohibited the sale, production and transport of alcohol. Immediately, Vannie and the Higgins gang saw an opportunity. Although the burglary business was paying well and the gang was successful, it was risky business. Vannie saw that they now had a nation who desperately wanted a drop of the good stuff and had nowhere to get it, or so it seemed at face value. Secret bars called speakeasies began cropping up all over New York, where you could get a drink quietly without the police or specialised prohibition agents knowing. In fact, it's estimated that there were over 32,000 speakeasies in New York alone during the height of Prohibition, and Vannie realised that these newly opened bars needed someone to keep them well stocked, and he identified himself as the man to do so. They began monopolising Bay Ridge, setting up numerous speakeasies in the area, including the gang's piece de resistance, the Florence, located on 3rd Avenue in the heart of town. The Higgins gang set up their headquarters at the Florence for their embryonic but successful bootlegging operation, and kept the whole of Bay Ridge quenched during the dry era thanks to the help of Vannie's old friend, Legs Diamond. Legs, being a natural thief, opted against setting up his own bootlegging operation, as that seemed too much like hard work, and began hijacking other gangsters' shipments of booze on back roads in upstate New York as he tried to remain undetected by prohibition agents in the dead of night. He would then give his boss Arnold Rothstein the stolen goods, who would use his connections in the underworld to sell the booze to the highest bidder and take a cut. Vannie, needing a consistent supply of beer, whiskey and gin to stock the Florence and his other watering holes in Bay Ridge, struck a deal with Legs to buy some of the shipments directly, paying more than what Rothstein would pay him, and before long, some of the trucks the Diamond Gang had hijacked headed for Vannie's Bay Ridge waterfront warehouse and not Rothstein's Manhattan lockups. Vannie now wanted to direct the stream of stolen beer flowing his way into every speakeasy in Bay Ridge, not just his own, and paid a visit to the proprietors, letting them know that they now needed to buy their alcohol from him. With the introduction of Prohibition, or the Volstead Act as it was called, it wasn't only Vannie who had the idea to sell illegal liquor. Most speakeasies in the Bay Ridge area at the time were supplied by independent 2-bit bootleggers who were brewing booze in the basement of their tenement building or making gin in their bathtubs. Needless to say, after a visit from Vannie and the boys, most speakeasy owners complied with their new distributor and began buying the booze from the Higgins outfit. However, there were occasionally a few owners who would refuse to change suppliers after some light intimidation from Higgins. Therefore, instead of destroying the bar and potentially losing future income for himself and the gang, Higgins decided to get rid of the supplier. Vannie's main competitor in Bay Ridge was an independent bootlegger called Lewis Wallinger. Wallinger was a well-known local hoodlum who had a considerable police record himself and was selling whiskey out of his family home at 6822 3rd Avenue. At 3 a.m. on December the 14th, 1926, Vannie sent 2 of his goons to put the frighteners on Wallinger and order him to stop selling booze, even offering him a lucrative sum to buy his one-man operation. Wallinger refused and sent them away, which would give Vannie Higgins the chance he needed to send shockwaves across Bay Ridge and show that he was serious about his threats. 3 hours later, at 6 a.m, Higgins sent Bad Bill Bailey, his main henchman, to Wallinger's address and gave him an ultimatum: either sell us the operation and stop making booze, or else. Wallinger, not thinking the Higgins gang was serious, again told Bad Bill to be on his way, and the next thing Wallinger's wife and his 3 children sleeping upstairs heard was 4 gunshots as Bad Bill, remaining true to his word, fired 4 slugs into Wallinger, who stumbled into his bathroom and died of his wounds. As Bad Bill fled, Wallinger's wife caught a glimpse of him and instantly recognised him, giving the police his name when they turned up 20 minutes later. The police arrested Bad Bill and believed they had an open and shut case, with all fingers pointing towards Bailey as the killer. However, his boss Vannie had other plans. He forked out over $20,000, around $350,000 today, for Bad Bill's defence, and even took to the stand himself. Looking the jury in the eyes and using his natural charisma, charm and persuasiveness, Vannie convinced them that Bad Bill was playing cards with him at the Florence at the time of the murder. It probably also helped that the jury were all Bay Ridge residents and therefore known to Vannie, who greased their palms with green, and if they didn't accept his briberies, Vannie sent his mob round to have a quiet word with them. Most of the time it would be a one-way conversation, however, as they'd usually end up with a pistol stuck down their throats. Inevitably, with Vannie using his bootlegging books to also line the pockets of the judge, and after intimidating the jury, Bad Bill beat the rap to nobody's surprise, apart from the handful of Bay Ridge police officers who actually weren't on Vannie's payroll, and they began to keep a dossier on the Higgins gang. As the 1920s began to roar and Vannie continued his rise to bootlegging king of the borough, more bodies began turning up in and around Bay Ridge. 2 months after the murder of Lewis Wallinger, a member of the Higgins gang, Edward Fallon, was released from Sing Sing prison after being arrested for grand larceny. Fallon had spent 3 years inside and, even though Vannie had visited him, made sure his family were looked after and kept his spot free in the gang. Edward Fallon decided he wanted to go into bootlegging on his own, something that Vannie did not allow in Bay Ridge. Despite numerous persuasive talks from old pal Higgins and the gang, Fallon continued selling his homebrewed rum to speakeasies in the area, undercutting Vannie's prices, and even gained the moniker of the rum vendor. This lasted for 2 weeks after his release, until the morning of February the 2nd, 1927, when he was selling rum on a crowded corner of 51st Street and 3rd Avenue, when a Cadillac full of Higgins gang members cruised past with 2 Thompson submachine guns pointing out the back windows and began firing. The first shots directed at Fallon shattered a store's display case which was in front of him as he was standing in the doorway, as displayed in this image recreated by the Brooklyn Daily Eagle the day after the attack. At the roaring sound of Tommy gun fire and the glass smashing, Edward Fallon ran along the high street with the hail of bullets following him. 1 bullet pierced his right side and another landed in his leg. He managed to run into the lobby of an office block a few doors down, where he collapsed and died a few minutes after. Police again suspected the Higgins gang of this murder, with Fallon being an ex-member, but there was little to no evidence to go off, and any witnesses present were not going to risk their lives to try and indict Vinnie or his boys after seeing how Fallon was murdered in broad daylight. This was the first time a Tommy gun had ever been used in Bay Ridge, and it struck fear into the hearts of many, so anyone who did see the incident kept quiet. 4 months later, in June 1927, the body of Bay Ridge bootlegger Michael McNamara was found in an empty lot in Queens. He had been dead for at least 2 weeks and had been perforated by bullets 7 times, leading police to believe that he was again murdered with a Tommy gun. McNamara was apparently also a one-time friend of Vannie's, but the two had recently had a falling out. Like Fallon, he began selling his own liquor in Bay Ridge and met the same fate as Fallon, death courtesy of the Higgins gang. 6 months later, on the 14th of December 1927, exactly 1 year after Bad Bill ended Lewis Wallinger's life in his family home, Salvatore Sammy Orlando, a bloodthirsty bootlegger from Brooklyn who had encroached into Vannie's territory of Bay Ridge and had been forcing speakeasy owners to buy his booze or he'll blow up the joint, was cruising in his sedan down 42nd Street when another car sped up behind him and began blowing its horn. Orlando made the fatal mistake of pulling over, and as he did, Bad Bill Bailey and Vannie Higgins opened fire with sawn-off shotguns, killing him instantly. 10 minutes later, when police arrived, they found Sammy Orlando dead, slumped over the steering wheel. Upon searching the car, they found 3 cases of whiskey, which he was presumably about to drop off to a previously threatened speakeasy owner. It's thought that Vannie was informed by said speakeasy owner and got the drop on Sammy. Sammy was the last real threat for the Higgins gang in Bay Ridge, as most of the Brooklyn gangsters were wise enough to not encroach on Vannie's territory, given his lack of hesitation for violence he had showcased in the last 12 months. The Higgins gang had now wiped out any rival bootleggers in Bay Ridge that had the nerve to go toe-to-toe with the gang, and Vannie had now taken control of the whole alcohol supply of Bay Ridge, and every single drink that the 100,000 plus population drank was either supplied or sold by the Higgins gang. Vannie had pretty much every Bay Ridge police officer on his payroll, so any bodies that had been turning up were not linked to him. The newspaper editors also took bulging brown envelopes on a weekly basis from his minions, so most of the press Vannie received was all positive. He was seen as a snappy-dressed, kind-hearted, generous businessman who had been dragged up in a tenement building on 4th Avenue and made something of himself. He was always sure to be seen donating to local charities, funding food banks and helping out those lesser off than him, making sure that the papers were always around to snap his photo during the act, praising the rum-running king of Bay Ridge. With Bay Ridge conquered, the Higgins gang began to expand their territory and quickly took over the alcohol supply of every speakeasy in the surrounding neighbourhoods of Dyker Heights, Bensonhurst, Borough Park and Gravesend Bay, absorbing the territory with little to no resistance from the independent bootleggers who folded under the immense firepower and pressure that Vannie could unload onto them. The name Vannie Higgins was now one respected in the underworld and feared by rival bootleggers, and the Higgins gang of Bay Ridge was a force to be reckoned with. Unfortunately for Vannie, his smooth sailing operation was soon to hit its first roadblock. His main supplier of booze, Legs Diamond, was about to suffer the second of many assassination attempts on his life, and Vannie's stream of illegal beer, whiskey and gin, which was provided courtesy of the shipments Legs had hijacked from other mobsters in New York, was going to dry up. As Diamond continued his ascension through the New York underworld, his swanky dress sense, natural charisma with journalists, and fearlessness of hijacking rival bootleggers made for great newspaper headlines. However, it soon became clear that all this attention had gone to Legs' head, and he began feeling invincible, quickly beginning to branch out from hijacking minor bootleggers' shipments to hijacking shipments belonging to more feared and respected mobsters. Had Diamond stuck with ripping off small-time bootleggers, he would have been okay, but with his uncontrollable attraction for big scores and his fearlessness of consequences led to trouble with some formidable gangsters in New York, namely Big Bill Dwyer, who along with his partner Frank Costello were Manhattan's biggest suppliers of illegal booze. At first, nothing was done about Diamond, as Big Bill Dwyer didn't want to engage in a beer war with his boss, Arnold Rothstein, who ran the show in New York. Arnold Rothstein was known popularly as the Brain, and quite simply was the money and brains behind most of New York City's underworld activities. AR, as he was known by his colleagues, began the century as a gambler, and as his bank account grew, so did his position in the criminal world. By the start of Prohibition, Rothstein was on a mission to transform organised crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a business run like a corporation, and had gained notoriety as the first person who realised that Prohibition was a business opportunity, an untapped money-making scheme with limitless potential for crime bosses like himself to make a fortune. His enormous wealth made him the go-to guy for any enterprising young hood with a good idea but without sufficient capital to see it through, and he quickly became the mentor of many budding criminals with great potential. Rothstein could act as the face of organised crime, whilst his band of merry men could do the dirty work and keep the whiskey and beer flowing in the thirsty streets of New York City. He became the go-between for gangsters and the politicians, dubbing himself as Mr. Fix-It. Rothstein could act as a fence, help out with labour disputes, and assist in getting the right candidate elected. In the 1920s, if it was illegal and could make him money, he probably had his fingers in it. However, it was this aforementioned band of merry men that Big Bill Dwyer was wary of. Arnold Rothstein's protégés were the cream of the crop of New York's rising criminal stars. Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel and Legs Diamond were the main lieutenants in the Rothstein ranks. These were all ambitious hoodlums who had already proved themselves as ruthless killers, and if they needed to repeat the deed to prove themselves to their boss Rothstein to elevate themselves, they certainly would. This was something that Big Bill Dwyer was well aware of, and so, in the early years of Vannie setting up his Bay Ridge operation, Legs Diamond was free to hijack whatever he wanted, with Rothstein protecting him, and therefore kept Vannie speakeasies and customers well stocked. But after a few more years and a few more high-valued shipments mysteriously disappearing, Dwyer and Costello quit worrying about Rothstein and his protégés and sent out a pack of bloodthirsty killers on the hunt for Legs Diamond. Just after 4 o'clock in the morning on July the 1st, as Diamond was driving up 5th Avenue in Manhattan, a sedan full of Italian gunmen, associates of Frank Costello, pulled up alongside him armed with a shotgun and 2 pistols. As Diamond turned his head to glance at the sedan, there was a quick explosion as 64 shotgun pellets peppered Legs' head and body, and a 4.5 bullet clipped his heel as the sedan quickly sped off. Diamond survived the ordeal, but this close shave with death had made it clear to him that he needed to be more selective with the shipments he was targeting to steal, and apparently the buckshot knocked some sense into his fearless mind, because he instantly stopped ripping off Dwyer and Costello, which meant that the amount of shipments he could hijack was dramatically reduced, and therefore the remaining ones he got his hands on he had to give to Rothstein, and there was none spare to siphon off for Vannie, which left our man in a bad situation. If Vannie couldn't establish a new supplier in the early weeks of 1928, the speakeasy owners would have to look elsewhere to quench the thirsty throats of Bay Ridge and his new territory of South Brooklyn. Vannie explored his options. He could buy from Arnold Rothstein, who was no doubt the biggest importer of booze in the States, with over 40 sources of booze flowing his way, but the brain charged extortionate prices, and being a helpless gambler, the consistent weekly shipments that Higgins desired would be affected depending on whether Rothstein was on a lucky streak or not. Waxy Gordon was another option. Gordon ran a lot of Rothstein's rum running in New York and Philadelphia, but had his own distilleries and breweries where he could sell whatever Rothstein didn't need to Vannie. But Waxy's liquor wasn't very high quality, and Vannie eventually had plans to mix with the upper echelons of New York and knew his ticket to get there was through supplying them with the best product available. His last option was to use Jack Hart, the biggest bootlegger in Maryland, whom he had a meeting with at one of Hart's speakeasies in Baltimore. Whilst the two were discussing business, a rival gang of Jack Hart's peppered the speakeasy with machine gun fire after a dispute about territory. Quickly fleeing the speakeasy, VANNIE was shot in the leg by police after being mistaken for one of the bootleggers involved in the brawl. Needless to say, VANNIE was put off dealing in Baltimore. He was also not liking the quality of Waxy Gordon's booze, and with Rothstein's supply from other vendors too inconsistent depending on if his luck and cash was in or not, VANNIE decided to take control of the lack of booze himself. VANNIE controlled South Brooklyn and thus the bottom left corner of Long Island. Central Brooklyn and Queens aside, VANNIE knew that the rest of Long Island was there for the taking, and he would face little to no resistance from any 2-bit bootleggers operating there, and, if conquered, would control the whole of the coast of Long Island, which meant he could set up his own smuggling operation using ships and speedboats, mitigating the need to use a middleman to get his hands on illegal liquor. VANNIE had identified a Canadian supplier through his old friend Legs Diamond, who could produce a quality of whiskey which would outshine anything being poured in New York at the time. The whiskey was of a premium price, but that price matched VANNIE's ambitions of breaking into the upper echelons of society and brushing shoulders with politicians who could offer him even more protection. The Canadian supplier would also provide him with the beer he needed to keep his current territory wet, and thus the Higgins gang went to work to establish their new rum-running operation. Throughout February and March 1928, the Higgins gang began absorbing territory in Long Island. They first took Oyster Bay with little to no resistance, just like when they expanded their territory from Bay Ridge to the local neighbourhoods of Dyker Heights, Bensonhurst and the like. The speakeasies and illegal alcohol was supplied by the same independent bootleggers making beer in their basements or gin in their bathtubs. After pressure from the Higgins gang to stay out or get rubbed out, the one-man bands of Oyster Bay all complied with the crew's request. They had never seen an operation as organised as the Higgins operation, nor had they seen so much firepower readily available to a single entourage. This was a single aspect that Higgins did not skimp out on. The crew's arsenal was not a secret, and VANNIE liked to make sure that his rivals knew this. The crew had an abundance of Tommy guns and extended drums to carry more ammunition, which were top of the range for the time. They had pipe bombs, smoke bombs, hand grenades, pistols, rifles, steel vests, fountain pen pistols, silencers, and ammo for all the above, gallons upon gallons of tear gas, and not to mention the fastest cars that money could buy at the time. VANNIE was naturally the flashy type, being driven around Long Island in the most expensive limousines, wearing suits he imported from Britain, and being constantly sandwiched between his two bodyguards, childhood pals and top lieutenants Bad Bill Bailey and Bob Benson, who would threaten, intimidate and murder for VANNIE at the drop of a hat. He made sure that his crew had the firepower to take over Long Island, which they were in the process of. With Oyster Bay conquered with no resistance, the Higgins gang began their pursuit of both Nassau and Suffolk County, where they would encounter established operations that put up more of a fight. The main threat they faced here was Leo Steinberg, who the press referred to as the beer baron of Nassau County. Any pictures of Leo Steinberg have sadly been lost to time, but he had a crew of around 40 men along with 3 breweries in Garden City, and initially rejected the gang's request to stop his operation and let VANNIE take over. A battle for Nassau County proceeded, with numerous shootouts in broad daylight which the streets of towns like Hempstead, Freeport and Hicksville had never seen before, with both sides taking casualties. Steinberg and his crew put up a good fight against the Higgins outfit, and Vannie needed a new game plan to take over Steinberg's territory. Back to the drawing board, the trio were back in Bay Ridge on June the 3rd, 1928. Vannie, Bad Bill and Bob were sitting in a limousine on 4th Avenue when a sedan pulled up with two Steinberg gang members who opened fire with a pistol. The trio leapt from the car and ran to safety in a grocery store without one bullet so much as grazing any of them. Whoever it was targeting them, Vannie was not going to take any chances, as his good friend and the boss of Brooklyn, Frankie Yale, had been murdered a few days before this attack whilst driving in central Brooklyn, a place, like Vannie with Bay Ridge, the gang boss thought he was safe in. Vannie and the Higgins gang went on the attack, scrapping any potential tactics and settling on all-out bloody rampage. 3 days after the Bay Ridge shooting, 42-year-old Joseph Buick was found at the side of a road in West Hampton with 2 bullet holes to the back of the head. Joseph was the main lieutenant of Leo Steinberg and had been taken for a one-way ride by the Higgins gang, with Vannie personally executing him after Joseph refused to give up his boss, Leo Steinberg. Over the next 5 days, more bodies of Steinberg gang members were turning up dead in the marshes of Nassau County. Leo felt the noose tightening around his neck with the Higgins gang getting closer to calling time on his life, and agreed to Vannie's ultimatum of either stop selling and brewing booze or you'll end up in the Long Island marshes like your colleagues. Leo agreed and stepped down his operation. Vannie and his crew continued throwing their weight around and quickly progressed to taking over both Nassau and Suffolk County as 1928 soared by. Leo Steinberg was the last serious competition the gang were to face in the pursuit of taking over Long Island, and the residents began referring to Vannie, Bad Bill and Bob as the Unholy Three, a name garnered from a crime film from 1925 starring Lon Chaney, where 3 criminals joined together in an unholy plan to become wealthy, a story which suitably mirrors the one of the Higgins gang. With 90% of Long Island now under his control, his bankroll growing with his new territory, and his smuggling operation now having numerous potential drop-off points, Vannie would need to tap into his prohibition spoils once more to kit out his rum-running mission as he had done for his crew's firepower, and this was also an area he didn't skimp out on. Vannie wanted the most forward-thinking, established and well-run rum-running operation in the city. This was clear by his next purchases. He was going to use the coast and surrounding waters to smuggle his illegal whiskey and booze at night to flood the streets of Long Island during the day. But Vannie wasn't the first bootlegger to have this idea, and it was a risky operation as at the height of Prohibition, the New York waters were littered with Coast Guard craft specifically and strategically placed to stop rum running. The Coast Guard craft were quick, displaying their ability to capture and circle fleets of boats which had tried to smuggle whiskey into Manhattan in the years prior, usually boats owned by Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein realised the waters were too risky and thus imported his liquor in shipments of trucks, using back roads to get his booze into Manhattan. In order to make the seabound venture a success, Vannie's payroll expanded from Bay Ridge cops and officials to most cops on the island, who would all turn a blind eye to his rum-running missions and, with an extra roll of green, would also ignore the odd body turning up in the marshes in case any competition decided to resurface. With his new federal friends on his payroll, Vannie gained the knowledge that the Coast Guard boats were built by the Skopinich family of Freeport. Their family business was the Freeport Point Boatyard, and after a little visit from Vannie and the boys, the Skopinaches would build Vannie a fleet of boats for the right price, which were quicker than the Coast Guard craft and could outrun them during a chase in the waters. This was music to Vannie's ears. His Canadian connection was going to anchor their ships offshore at night to avoid detection, and if Higgins and the crew had speedboats which could outrun the Coast Guard boats, this dramatically reduced the chance of any illegal smuggling ventures being halted and seized. Vannie ordered 6 speedboats to be built by the Skopinach family at Freeport Point Boatyard, and within 4 weeks they were all built, including a boat Vannie dubbed the Cigarette, which the press described as the fastest boat in New York waters, and they weren't wrong. The Cigarette cost Vannie a little more than the other 5 speedboats they had made, but it had the fastest engine money could buy at the time, able to do around 70 miles per hour whilst carrying 600 cases of whiskey at its top speed, and it was more than capable of outrunning any boat around, let alone the Coast Guard boats. Vannie's smuggling venture started in June 1928 and, within a few months, was a complete success. The Coast Guards were hardly seizing any shipments, and the Canadian supplier was able to anchor their ships out of the radius of detection of the Coast Guard craft, relying on the speedboat's sheer power to outrun the craft and unload their cargo in safety at one of the many drop-off points the gang had set up along the southern coast of Long Island. With the Cigarette's success, it made headlines in the bigger papers of New York, and thus the name stuck, which is why we call them cigarette boats today. Vannie expanded his gang, absorbing any Long Island rum runners he had previously threatened to stay away from bootlegging to join his organisation. He bought over 50 trucks to transport the booze from the coast of Long Island to the towns and neighbourhoods inland, and paid his new recruits handsomely to help out on the shipments and trucks. Vannie also invested in a fleet of taxis to take the booze from the trucks before entering the towns and cities. Thinking that it might attract too much attention from rival mobsters in Brooklyn or Queens, or the handful of Long Island policemen that wouldn't accept his bribes, for a large truck to take booze down the busy main roads, the fleet of taxis would casually cruise into town with a Higgins gang member riding in the back with numerous cases of whiskey. So, from the outside, it looked like the taxi driver, who was also another Higgins gang member, had a legitimate fare. They would then simply drop the cases off at various joints around Long Island, and the job was a good one that didn't attract any attention. Wanting insurance, Vannie decided to not only rely on his speedboats to smuggle his alcohol, but to use the skies as well. If the Coast Guards cracked down on a shipment or two, he wanted another avenue to be able to keep his clients quenched, and began taking flying lessons at Roosevelt Field Airport with his daughter Jean. Within 3 months, Vannie had his pilot's license and quickly became a flying enthusiast. He began acquiring an expensive collection of planes at his private runway in Hempstead, where he had 2 small but state-of-the-art cargo planes which were capable of flying directly to Canada to pick up the booze, and he had his favourite plane, a seaplane, which he would fly out to the ships docked just outside of the Coast Guard's view and land on the ocean, take the cargo and land back at his Hempstead runway, where trucks aplenty awaited him to take the booze inland. In a few short weeks, Vannie had birthed a major, organised and well-drilled smuggling operation which obtained the highest quality of booze directly from the supplier, and the Higgins gang were now not only a force to be reckoned with in terms of violence and firepower, but also in terms of the product that they could supply. It was, quite frankly, the best whiskey available in New York and probably in the States, and Vannie wasted no time in getting his superior booze in front of the right people. At around the same time that Vannie had set up his professional prohibition operation, his pal Legs Diamond was just back from Europe finalising narcotic deals for his boss, Mr. Rothstein. Rather like our man Vannie, Diamond had natural charisma, charm and persuasiveness, and had been sent by Mr. Rothstein to Amsterdam to get deals over the line with legitimate pharmaceutical companies to agree the purchase of hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of heroin. in which Rothstein planned to flood the streets of New York with. Diamond was successful in finalising the deals, and upon his arrival back in Manhattan, Diamond was given a $100,000 bonus from Rothstein and wasted absolutely no time in spending it. Every successful and self-respecting Prohibition-era gangster had a headquarters. Vannie's was the Florence, located in the heart of Bay Ridge, and Diamond longed for a place of his own. A natural show-off, the narcissistic Diamond planned to create the most luxurious speakeasy in the city and bought a vacant lot located on the second floor of 378 East 149th Street in the Bronx and called his watering hole headquarters the Bronx Theatrical Club. It consisted of 3 rooms which were luxuriously furnished with $25,000 worth of wall tapestries, no doubt ones he had lifted in his pre-heroin robbery days. It was the absolute picture of grandeur with dazzling hand-painted artwork acquired by Diamond on his travels in Europe, gold-plated banisters and elaborate chandeliers. It was a far cry from the unsophisticated fellow Bronx speakeasies where you would usually indulge on a dirty glass full of piss-weak needle beer that had been slid down the length of the bar at you in an abrupt manner. This was deliberate by Diamond. He wanted everyone to know in New York that he was now one of the real kingpins in town. In his luxurious speakeasy, Diamond needed the finest booze in New York to pour into the crystal glassware that it was drunk out of, and his pal VANNIE HIGGINS could supply it. Vannie offered Legs a sample of the whiskey to sell at his club one Saturday night. Needless to say, it went down a treat. Before long, Vannie was supplying 500 cases of whiskey a week to the Bronx Theatrical Club, and the speakeasy became a great success with the affluent locals who wanted to relax in the most expensive environment and have the most expensive booze to pair with it. The Bronx Theatrical Club was so successful that speakeasies around the Bronx and Manhattan wanted to exclusively buy the product, which was making the club such a hit. Big Bill Dwyer had slowly phased out of rum running after legal issues in 1926, and with Arnold Rothstein being knee-deep in dope, Diamond, with his main supplier VANNIE HIGGINS, was free to begin his rise to becoming the biggest bootlegger in Manhattan, providing whiskey, gin and beer to most of the watering holes, avoiding the watchful eye of the law in the Big Apple. The high-quality whiskey currently flooding the streets of Manhattan, courtesy of Vannie, caught the attention of 2 New York heavyweights in particular. The first was Owney Madden, an English-born son of Irish immigrants who was the one-time rival of Diamond when the pair were both in teenage street gangs. Madden had also had a meteoric rise in the underworld and now ran New York's biggest establishment, the Cotton Club, a nightclub located on Lenox Avenue who boasted a star-studded lineup of musical acts most evenings, with Duke Ellington, Ethel Waters and Louis Armstrong being regulars at the club. It was also the place to be seen in New York, with celebrities frequenting there on an almost nightly basis, such as Judy Garland, Eddie Cantor and Al Jolson, often occupying tables in the joint. Needless to say, with the clientele the Cotton Club was attracting, Owney Madden wanted to make sure that their heads were not turned by the whispers on Broadway and afar of Vannie and Diamond's superior whiskey, and instantly placed a weekly order with the duo, ultimately spending a small fortune, of which a large portion made its way to Vannie's pocket, bolstering his bankroll and his status in New York. The other heavyweight they attracted was the aforementioned Big Bill Dwyer, who would further bolster Vannie's status, this time, however, with Manhattan's elite, a crowd which Vannie had wanted to be part of and identified as a personal goal. Hearing the noise of Vannie and Diamond's whiskey, Big Bill Dwyer, who had ordered a hit on Diamond a few years prior, organised a meeting with Vannie. Big Bill took an instant liking to Vannie, and the pair had common ground, both being Irish, and Bill had mostly retired from the prohibition business with huge profits, now already owning the hockey teams, the New York Americans and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Dwyer was nicked a few years prior in 1925 for attempting to bribe Coast Guards, the same Coast Guards that Vannie was now outrunning on the waters surrounding Long Island. He served 13 months in Sing Sing and was now using his prohibition spoils to invest in legitimate businesses. However, he still needed a supplier of illegal booze for his swanky sporting events, and also liked to have the best booze in the city on hand when he entertained politicians and officials at his abode in Belle Harbor, Queens, and in any number of the Manhattan's apartments that he kept. He was also a member of many gentlemen's clubs in Manhattan and liked to be the guy who could source the good stuff for his political connections that Vannie also wanted to be in the good books of. Big Bill and Vannie struck a deal of a regular amount of cases each week, similar to the deal with Oni Madden, and before long, Big Bill and Vannie became good friends, with Vannie attending most of the aforementioned events and brushing shoulders with Manhattan's elite, and, more importantly, brushing shoulders with the most corrupt officials at Tammany Hall, the headquarters of the Democratic Party in New York City, which Vannie would need to lean on quicker than he expected. With his good friend Frankie Yale now pushing up daisies, and Vannie's newfound sense of importance and power, he decided that the remaining neighbourhoods in Brooklyn that were in between his territory and Manhattan, and which were dangerous to transport his liquor through from threat of rival bootleggers, was now going to be his, and he had the political power and the firepower to now do this. But before he could launch an attack, the feds came knocking. On the 13th of August 1928, as Vannie, Bad Bill and Bob Benson sat drinking in the Florence, masterminding a plan of how to take over the rest of Brooklyn and the neighbouring Queens, ultimately making the Higgins gang the undisputed kings of Long Island, police raided the joint and arrested the Unholy Three for the murder of Sammy Orlando the previous year. A new witness who seen the attack could place the trio at the shooting, and they were taken down to Bay Ridge Police Station by the few cops who were actually working on stopping the gang and not accepting handouts. But after only a few hours, Vannie, presumably using some of the influence from the more powerful men inside Tammany Hall and in other locations who were now on his payroll courtesy of introductions from Big Bill, arranged their release as the new witness that could place the Unholy Three at the scene decided that he didn't want to talk anymore. It's thought that the witness was cornered by a corrupt police officer inside the station before he was to pick the trio out in a police lineup, and had a pistol pushed into the side of his head, which resulted in him losing his memory and not being able to identify the men anymore. The Unholy Three were released, and a few weeks later they were now ready to absorb the rest of Brooklyn and move into controlling the alcohol supply of Queens as well. But once again, before they could start their mission, the Higgins gang were called into action as trouble was brewing in Manhattan. Vannie's partner, Legs Diamond, had been on the receiving end of a couple of bullets for the third time in his life as he walked down a Lower East Side avenue with the Lower East Side's top gangster, Jacob Little Augie Organ. As the pair strolled, Organ was assassinated by his lieutenants for cutting Diamond in on their gang's spoils in return for Legs supplying him booze and throwing some dope from his boss Rothstein Little Augie's way. To stop Legs from returning fire, the assassins pumped a few slugs into Diamond and he was rushed to a nearby hospital where, in typical Legs Diamond fashion, he eventually made a full recovery. The bad news didn't stop there for Diamond either, as a month or so later, in November, his pal and former boss Arnold Rothstein was murdered at the Park Central Hotel on 7th Avenue after a dispute over a gambling debt. In a similar story to Little Augie, whilst Diamond was recuperating in hospital, two of his lieutenants, Dutch Schultz and Joey Noy, were also looking to branch off from their boss. The pair decided that they didn't want to hang around for Legs to fully recover and to go into the bootlegging business on their own. Together, they opened up the Hub Social Club on Brook Avenue in the Bronx and began importing high-quality beer from New Jersey breweries, which went down a treat with the Bronx locals, who were usually drinking slop that a two-bit bootlegger had brewed in the basement of his tenement building. Success came quickly for Schultz and Noy, and soon they were muscling rival bootleggers out of business, like the Higgins gang had in Bay Ridge, with a formidable Bronx brigade of gunmen, including Bo Weinberg and Mad Dog Coll, probably the two most feared assassins in New York at the time. These bloodthirsty disciples of Schultz and Noy made their enterprise a force to be reckoned with, and they knew it. Once the Bronx was conquered, the Schultz-Noy entourage wanted to quench the thirst of the Manhattan crowd, a crowd whose thirst was already being quenched by their former boss, Diamond, who was now back in action supplying most of the speakeasies in Manhattan with all the illegal booze that they could wish for, courtesy of Vannie's elite smuggling operation. Upon hearing the request from the Schultz-Noy gang to muscle into Manhattan, Diamond set up a meeting with the duo at a New York club called the Chateau Madrid, with an apparent intention of accepting a cash payment from the Schultz-Noy outfit in exchange for relinquishing some Manhattan territory. In reality, Diamond had double-crossed them and sent his main assassins to murder Joey Noy on the sidewalk as he left the Chateau Madrid, which absolutely devastated Dutch Schultz and started the Manhattan Beer War. This was a bloody battle between the two factions, Dutch and the Bronx mob versus Legs Diamond and the Manhattan Boys, of which the Higgins gang were now part of, having aligned themselves with Diamond and temporarily stalling their advancement into Brooklyn. The Higgins gang's arsenal was to be given a complete run-out during the battle with Dutch Schultz. Vannie equipped his soldiers with Tommy guns, silenced rifles and a pistol each. He also began stink bombing the joints in Manhattan that the Dutch gang had been able to take from them, and quickly upgraded to sending the Dutchman hand grenades through the windows of some of his establishments. This was the first time that the streets of New York had seen such violence and firepower in its history. This showed that not only was Vannie innovative with his smuggling operation, but he also liked to pioneer the way for modern firepower as well. It was during this time that Vannie gained a reputation for absolute recklessness in gang warfare. He would often orchestrate drive-by shootings himself, sometimes even leaving the vehicle and unloading his machine gun on the street in full view into the Dutchman's minions' direction. This was the kind of risk that Vannie was willing to take, knowing he now had protection from above. During an interview with a New York newspaper a few days after one of the many gun battles with Dutch Schultz's gang, "I never let my boys take risks I don't take," which, judging from his recent exploits, wasn't many. During the war, a number of Dutch's speakeasies were targeted with grenades, including the Club Abbey and the Chateau Madrid, the spot where Joey Noy was gunned down. The Higgins gang also targeted the Dutchman's breweries and distilleries. On the morning of December the 14th, 1928, Vannie and Bad Bill threw hand grenades into 3 of the Dutchman's warehouses on Westchester Avenue in the Bronx, destroying the buildings and all the booze stored inside. Eventually, after 3 months of tit-for-tat killings, which took around 10 lives on each side, Legs Diamond decided that the Dutchman was too dangerous and was not going to back down, thinking it was only a matter of time before he endured his 4th and perhaps final assassination attempt. He went into hiding. We'll never know whether the Higgins gang could have won the war against the Schultz entourage, as Vannie withdrew when Legs did, not seeing the need to fight anymore, but I wouldn't have backed against them with the arsenal that they had. Thus, Manhattan was the Dutchman's, and with Vannie and Diamond now muscled out, Diamond began replicating his Manhattan operation in upstate New York, using Vannie as the main supplier. This kept the money rolling in, but it was nothing like the kind of green that they were seeing when they supplied Manhattan. Having just the Cotton Club and a few cases a week to Big Bill Dwyer left as his only customers in Manhattan, Vannie needed no invitation to finally proceed with his takeover of Brooklyn and Queens. The gang reloaded their arsenal, having spent some stock on the war with Schultz, and began their takeover. Logically, they decided on taking over one neighbourhood at a time, a similar method to how they conquered the rest of Long Island. They first muscled into Sunset Park and Carroll Gardens, further expanding their grip on the Brooklyn waterfront and setting up more drop-off spots for the Cigarette and their other boats along the bay. 2 weeks later, they took Flatbush, Crown Heights, Borough and Sunset Park, with little to no resistance from any two-bit bootleggers there. As they moved into downtown Brooklyn and Bedford-Stuyvesant, they began stepping on the toes of terrible Tommy Connell. Tommy was an Irish-born menace who had a police record which would go toe-to-toe with the Unholy Threes. He had been born in the slums of Williamsburg and had an Irish gang who worshipped him and every corrupt cop in central Brooklyn on his payroll. As daunting as this might have been, he couldn't lace Vannie's boots. Vannie was the biggest bootlegger in the city behind Dutch Schultz and had the second biggest army and arsenal behind the Dutchman. He also had a substantial bankroll and the corrupt cops would protect whoever paid the most. Tommy's threats of battle were not going to deter Vannie with the power he had in the city, and thus blood began to flow on Brooklyn streets. The Higgins gang launched attacks on terrible Tommy's lockups, with Bad Bill getting a chance to again pick up his favoured grenades, destroying 2 of terrible Tommy's breweries in Bushwick on February of 1929. Vannie's tactic was to stop the beer and cut the source of terrible Tommy's operation. While simultaneously using his Tammany Hall connections, Vannie was quickly relieving cops from Tommy's payroll onto his own, and as the bodies of terrible Tommy's gang members kept turning up on Brooklyn Street corners, he must have felt the noose was tightening around his neck. The first 2 weeks of March 1929 resulted in 2 separate attacks on Tommy's headquarters on Flatbush Avenue, where the gang leader luckily escaped bullets from the end of Bob Benson's machine gun, but did result in the death of 2 of his lieutenants. With the pressure from the Higgins gang's attacks, his brewery's crew and bankroll depleted, terrible Tommy asked Vannie for a peace meeting. On March the 18th, Vannie, Bad Bill and Bob met with terrible Tommy and his muscle, a corrupt cop called Daniel Maloney. By day, Maloney was a community officer serving the Brooklyn community. By night, he was terrible Tommy's right-hand man, serving terrible Tommy and murdering the community on his orders. This particular night, Maloney was armed to the teeth, taking no risks with a sit-down with a gangster as powerful and violent as Vannie Higgins. Maloney had 2 pistols in addition to his service revolver and a sawed-off shotgun, just in case anything kicked off. The location for the rendezvous was one of Vannie's speakeasies in Bay Ridge called the Owl's Head Tavern, on the corner of 69th Street and 3rd Avenue. Also accompanying Vannie was a fearless assassin from Baltimore called Paul Eckhart, an accomplice of Vannie's who he'd met whilst trying to find a new supplier after Legs Diamond stopped hijacking shipments. Vannie thought he might need someone from out of town to help keep the peace. At around midnight, the 5 men entered the tavern and occupied Vannie's table on the 2nd floor. Maloney might have been armed to the teeth, but the Owl's Head Tavern was one of many of Vannie's joints that he kept a small arsenal at, and this one was on the 3rd floor. Located on the corner of 69th and 3rd, the Higgins gang had a clear view from the 2nd or 3rd floors of any oncoming vehicles with any of terrible Tommy's men in case they had set a trap. Vannie had men on every street corner dressed as civilians with Tommy guns under their jackets in case of an attack. He had Higgins members sit in sedans at the top of 3rd Avenue, which is where terrible Tommy would escape back to Brooklyn, ready to give chase and shoot him down in case of trouble. These men were not needed though, as all the action took place at the Owl's Head Tavern. Around 30 minutes passed with Vannie picking up on the hostility of Daniel Maloney more than once, telling the corrupt cop to relax. Terrible Tommy was requesting that the Higgins gang stay out of central Brooklyn, a bold move considering Vannie now held all the cards. Vannie gave the usual ultimatum to Tommy, one he had given the other bootleggers on Long Island: get out of Brooklyn or be rubbed out. The two factions, not being able to decide on peace, left the meeting in a slanging match, and with the tavern packed on this roaring 20s Monday night, Vannie chased Tommy and Daniel Maloney outside. Maloney produced his two pistols, firing them simultaneously at Vannie, Bob and Bad Bill. Bad Bill, being the best sharpshooter in the Higgins entourage, fired 3 shots at Terrible Tommy and the corrupt cop Maloney, landing a bullet in Tommy's leg, who stumbled into the Owl's Head Tavern for protection. With the police nearby, onto the scent that something was going to happen with so many Higgins men on the beat tonight, the police were instantly on hand and ran onto 3rd Avenue, brandishing their weapons. Thinking that the cops were Higgins men, Maloney fired a shot at one cop but missed. The cop returned fire with 4 bullets, landing 2 in the head and chest of Daniel Maloney, who collapsed and died on 69th Street in an ever-growing pool of blood. Vannie, Bad Bill and Bob were already halfway down 69th Street whilst this unfolded, and just before they entered their sedan, responding cops picked up Vannie and Paul Eckhart whilst Bad Bill and Bob escaped. The police later picked up Terrible Tommy at the Owl's Head Tavern and brought all 3 men into the station for questioning. At the time, the police didn't know that Maloney was in Tommy's ranks, so the story made front page news, thinking that one of their own had been slaughtered. It wasn't until Tommy told them the next morning that Maloney was in his ranks and on his payroll that the police knew, and evidently he'd kept it pretty quiet from them. The trio were charged with felonious assault, and again, Vannie had to lean on his Tammany Hall and Big Bill Dwyer associates to get him out of the pickle. Within 12 hours, the 3 men were released, and whilst in the cell, Terrible Tommy agreed to stop his bootlegging operation and moved out of Brooklyn, leaving it all for Vannie. Vannie took control of Frankie Yale's old territory, and even made some new friends in Brownsville in the form of Murder Inc. members Harry Pittsburgh, Phil Strauss and Martin Bugsy Goldstein, who he had met when taking over the neighbourhood. Murder Inc. were the murder-for-hire arm of the Italian mob and had their base at the Midnight Rose candy store on Saratoga Avenue in Brownsville. They would also accept foreigners, as they called them, jobs that weren't directly from the Italian mob, and it was handy for Vannie to have these connections in case he needed anyone whacked. With the whole of Brooklyn and Queens now under his control, the press were now referring to Vannie as the bootlegging king of the borough, when really it should have been the bootlegging king of Long Island, as he had completely wiped out the competition from Long Island and had 99% of the police officers operating there on his payroll. With the money now coming in thick and fast, even more than Vannie was making when he and Legs were supplying most of Manhattan, Vannie upgraded his operation. First of all, the crew's fleet of vehicles were upgraded to 16-cylinder luxury Cadillac coupes. Bad Bill and Bob Benson were also paid more handsomely than ever, as well as the rest of the Higgins gang. Higgins bought a swanky apartment at 7420 Ridge Boulevard, where his newly wedded wife, Grace DeMayo, raised his daughter, Jean. Another wedding had also been attended by the Higgins gang in late 1929, as Bob Benson married Bad Bill's sister, and now the 2 childhood friends were brother-in-laws, making the bond between the unholy 3 even stronger. As 1930 unfolded, Vannie swanned around Bay Ridge, Brooklyn and the rest of Long Island like he owned the joint, which he practically did. The Higgins gang had gone from knocking off 2-bit bootleggers in Bay Ridge to controlling the whole alcohol supply of Long Island and having the most forward-thinking and best smuggling operation in the land. Enjoying the extensive political protection from many of New York's politicians and public officials, Vannie felt untouchable and had finally achieved his goal of being one of New York's elite. No other event epitomizes this more than when he landed one of his planes at the prison of Comstock in upstate New York to have dinner with his childhood friend and now the warden of the prison, Joseph Wilson. The meeting between the two was covered heavily in the New York newspapers, and Joseph Wilson was criticised by the then governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had recently sent state troopers to upstate New York to put a halt to Legs Diamond's operation, which he had been running for a few years with Vannie as his booze supplier. The carefree nature of landing his plane at a state prison and having dinner with the warden shows the kind of power that Vannie had, and everything was going swimmingly in the bootlegging king of the borough's life until some old competition resurfaced on his territory. During the summer of 1930, a number of Vannie's shipments began to mysteriously disappear. The trucks would be filled with booze from the boats and then driven inland towards Brooklyn, but the cargo, truck and truck driver would never be seen again. With the whole of Long Island on his payroll, if his whiskey was being sold elsewhere, or if a speakeasy on the island stopped buying from him, he would have detected it, but the gang had heard nor detected anything. As the weeks went by, the shipments disappearing were more and more regular, so Vannie had an armed guard put on every shipment to ensure its safe delivery. On September the 26th, 1930, police received a tip that the old beer baron of Nassau County, Leo Steinberg, was due to receive a shipment delivered by boat on Long Beach from a supplier also located in Canada. Vannie had eliminated Steinberg's crew the year before, and he had relocated after Vannie offered him an ultimatum of leave or death, and now Vannie suspected that it was Steinberg behind the missing shipments. Leo had made the fatal mistake of ignoring Vannie's orders, and the police who were on Higgins' payroll informed Vannie and the Coast Guards to intercept the shipment. The smugglers' boats not being as quick as the Cigarette and Co., the booze was apprehended easily. As Leo and an associate waited nervously for their shipment on the boardwalk of Long Beach, Vannie and Bob Benson exited their sedan on Edwards Boulevard and kidnapped the pair, throwing them into the boot of the vehicle. They executed the pair near West Hampton, weighted their bodies down and tossed them into the sea. As 1930 turned into 1931 and the press continued conjuring theories as to what happened to Leo Steinberg, Vannie's shipments continued to disappear and he was losing men, trucks and booze at a rapid rate. In April 1931, Vannie got word that they were being hijacked in Queens by Frank McManus, a small bootlegger from Manhattan. McManus worked for Dutch Schultz and operated a number of his speakeasies in Manhattan for him. Frank McManus's brother was George Hump McManus, who was largely suspected of murdering Arnold Rothstein over that gambling debt. Vannie was told that Frank's boys were hijacking the shipments on Dutch Schultz's orders, bribing the truck drivers and armed guards to join the Schultz entourage and leave Higgins' organisation. Enraged, Vannie, Bad Bill and Bob Benson led the rest of the Higgins crew to the Blossom Heath Inn on West 57th Street in Manhattan, a Dutch Schultz speakeasy that Frank McManus ran for him. Confronting McManus about the shipment, Vannie refused to believe that he had no part of it. Frank profusely denied hijacking any shipments and offered to show Vannie to the cellar where he'd find none of his product. Vannie continued to suspect and interrogate McManus, who could see that the two factions were getting nowhere, and asked Vannie and his boys to leave. When Vannie refused to leave until Frank told him who had hijacked the shipment, a fight between the two broke out in the Blossom Heath and Vannie was stabbed 6 times during the ruckus. Bleeding heavily from his serious stab wounds, Bob Benson and Bad Bill carried Vannie to the sedan and took him to the Polyclinic Hospital. Thinking their boss was a goner, Bad Bill and Bob both said goodbye Vannie before paying the nurses to take care of him and fleeing the hospital before the police arrived. Seriously wounded, the police gave Vannie no rest and continued to interrogate him on his deathbed. Vannie continued to refuse to identify his attackers, sticking to the underworld code, and was eventually left alone by the police. Miraculously, Vannie recovered from the stabbing after just 6 weeks of recuperation at his Ridge Boulevard apartment, and he was back commanding his ranks in June of 1931. Whilst Vannie was recovering, Bob Benson had been acting strangely, to say the least. He was scarcely seen around the crew's headquarters of the Florence and had been dropping hints to Bad Bill that it was their time to run the Higgins outfit. Bob was banking on the fact that Higgins wasn't going to pull through the stabbing and had been planting seeds to Bad Bill that they needed to plan their takeover for when their boss expires. Bad Bill, ever loyal to Vannie, the man who had bailed him out of many court cases, been his best friend since they were 10 years of age, and took him under his wing whilst he rose to the top of Manhattan's elite, decided to do some detective work on his brother-in-law. After trailing his childhood friend for a few weeks, Bad Bill found out that it was Bob who was orchestrating the hijacking of the shipments. Bob had been working secretly with Dutch Schultz, taking payoffs from the Dutchman for inside information on the gang, with a promise from Dutch that once he had wiped out the Higgins outfit, Bob Benson would be a main star of the Schultz entourage. Bob had informed Dutch's men of the routes that Vannie's trucks took throughout Long Island, tending to prefer the back roads at night to avoid detection. He also made sure that the trucks which Dutch's men hijacked were ones where the armed guard and truck driver could be persuaded to join the Schultz operation for the right price. Eventually, Bob was planning to set Vannie up to be whacked in Brooklyn by one of Dutch's main assassins, probably Bo Weinberg. On top of this, Bob was also lashing out at his wife, Bill's sister, and this infuriated Bad Bill even more. Bad Bill retold this information to Vannie, and that had sealed the fact that the Unholy Three was about to become the Unholy Two. On October the 26th, 1931, Vannie and Bill departed the Florence in one of the many limousines the gang kept. Their destination was Little Italy in Manhattan, where Bob had been eating that evening with 5 associates, unaware that Bad Bill and Vannie knew that he'd been double-crossing them. As the group was leaving the restaurant, Vannie crept up behind Bob and fired a bullet into his brain. Bob dropped to the curb as the Schultz men ducked into a nearby alleyway, whilst Vannie and Bad Bill scattered from the murder scene. Weighing up the evidence, police immediately searched for Higgins and Bailey, who both went into hiding. The pair never actually left Long Beach, and even though the police saying that they were searching for them, it was only really the out-of-town incorruptible police officers that were actually on the duo's scent. Bad Bill and Vannie continued their business as usual, and there was no halt to their operation. Neither men showed up to Bob Benson's funeral, which took place on November the 2nd, 1931, but a plane containing 2 men circled the cemetery throughout the duration of the ceremony, no doubt Bad Bill and Vannie making their presence known and sending a message that even their own childhood friend and member of the Unholy Trio can be whacked, you best not cross Vannie and the gang. 4 days after the funeral, on November the 6th, Bad Bill and Vannie, accompanied by their lawyers, strolled into the district attorney's office. "I understand you've been looking for myself and Bailey," Vannie said to the DA. "Well, here we are." The district attorney explained that the police suspected their participation in the murder of Bob Benson. "We don't know anything about it," Vannie replied. The DA then asked Vannie if they were amongst the party who was out for dinner with Bob just before he was killed. "On the advice from our lawyers, we refused to make any further statement," the pair said, and both Bad Bill and Vannie were arrested. After spending around 5 days in jail, with Vannie leaning once again onto his political connections, both men were released, with the police citing a lack of evidence despite willing witnesses to the attack. after Bob expired, the hijackings stopped. Partly because Vannie changed the routes of the trucks and had also sent his men out after the scent of Schultz soldiers in Long Island, but also partly because the Dutchman was otherwise engaged in the bloodiest gang war that Manhattan had ever seen when his ex-chief henchman, Mad Dog Coll, decided to break away from the Schultz gang and try to muscle his old employer out of business, which quite literally turned Manhattan and the Bronx into shooting galleries with over 30 lives taken on each side. In November 1931, Vannie and Bad Bill were overseeing the unloading of his boats into trucks with a band of corrupt cops for protection, and Long Island's chief of police, Morris Grossman, personally there to receive the weekly payout from Vannie for him and his boys. As the shipment was nearly unloaded, 6 cars full of Prohibition agents swooped onto the gang and arrested all 17 of the men who were present. Prohibition agents had been working with the handful of cops in Long Island who were not on Vannie's payroll to make a swoop like this against the bootlegging king of the borough, and had been successful in their plans and pursuit, indicting all 17 with violating the Volstead Act and keeping them in prison with no option for bail. The bad news didn't stop there for Vannie either, as one of his closest friends and main customer, Jack Legs Diamond, was finally assassinated on December the 18th, 1931. It was the 5th and final attempt on Diamond's life as he lay drunk in a rooming house in Albany after being acquitted hours earlier. Dutch Schultz's main assassin, Bo Weinberg, picked the locks of Legs' front door and fired 3 bullets into his whiskey-soaked brain, putting an end to Diamond once and for all. Vannie was absolutely devastated. After a few weeks of mourning, Vannie's trial got underway in January 1932 and lasted for 10 days. The prosecution tried to prove that Higgins and various members of the Long Beach Police Department who were on his payroll and were running a smuggling ring together. Top witnesses of the prosecution included numerous bootleggers who Vannie had threatened during his takeover of Long Island, a number of Hampstead police officers who had rejected Vannie's bribery, and a Coast Guard captain who testified that he'd been offered $50,000, around $1 million today, to turn a blind eye to Vannie's shipments, but the Coast Guard captain refused, forcing Vannie to buy the fleet of boats spearheaded by the Cigarettes. After deliberating for an hour, no doubt having their palms greased by the rest of the Higgins crew and having significant pressure on them from Vannie's political connections, the jury found the men indicted not guilty, and Vannie was once again, courtesy of those connections, free to resume running his bootlegging empire in Long Island. As 1932 rolled on, Vannie targeted new territory to expand his organisation into. After Legs Diamond's murder, his operation in upstate New York had been taken over by independent bootleggers, and Vannie's supply was not in their demands, and he needed new territory to squeeze money out of. Manhattan was off limits, as Vannie didn't want to engage in another beer war and had recently seen the way that the last one had ended for Mad Dog Coll, who was machine gunned in a telephone booth on orders from Dutch Schultz. Looking down the coast, Vannie identified New Jersey as the next area where his crew and operation could spread their wings. Atlantic City was pretty much the only place Higgins identified as off limits for the crew. Atlantic City was currently run by corrupt treasurer Nucky Johnson, and even with the formidable force and power that Vannie Higgins had, he couldn't rival a man with the connections like Nucky Johnson. But apart from there, the rest of New Jersey was, like Long Island, made up of individual small bootlegging operations, and their territory would be easy to absorb once they made their move. Vannie and Bad Bill first targeted Perth and South Amboy, which, from Bay Ridge Harbour, was only a short boating journey away and, in the Cigarette, took no time at all. Once there, they began to target speakeasies and, with the usual pressure from Vannie and the boys, They soon keeled over and began buying booze from Vannie. From there, the gang advanced into Keyport and Union Beach, wanting to increase their control of the coast before heading inland into New Brunswick with their eventual aim of controlling the bigger city of Trenton. In May 1932, whilst Vannie was in the cigarette on his way to the shores of Long Beach on a rum-running venture, he was caught by the Coast Guard as he docked, and after a further search of the cigarette, they found over $180,000 worth of whiskey, around $4 million's worth today. An absolutely astronomical sum even for Vannie, who, at his heyday, was estimated to be worth around $6 million, about $11 million today. Back at the station, Vannie said he was just a lobster fisherman and had no idea of the cargo that was on his boat. Again, leaning on his political connections and greasing the Coast Guards where he could, Vannie was released scot-free. By June 1932, the Higgins gang's colonisation of New Jersey was well underway, and Vannie saw this as a needs must, with his upstate New York money now stopped as a result of the death of Diamond and Manhattan still under the control of the bloodthirsty, ruthless Dutch Schultz. But it seems Vannie might have pissed a few people off with his encroachment into New Jersey, and the Irish bootlegging king's luck was about to run out. On June the 18th, 1932, Vannie and his wife Grace were attending a children's dance recital at the Knights of Columbus Clubhouse in Prospect Park, Brooklyn. Jean, their daughter, was 7 years old and one of the children performing. After the children's show, there was dancing for the adults. At around midnight, the trio left via a side door on Union Street, laughing and joking as they began walking to Vannie's limousine. As Vannie opened his luxury Cadillac coupe, a dark sedan came rolling slowly towards him and began firing from about 20 feet away. His daughter, Jean, was hit first through her earlobe. Vannie pushed Jean onto the running board of the car and ran out into the open, drawing the fire away from his family. Whoever this was that was trying to kill Vannie must have been absolute savage dogs to do it in front of his family. Vannie ran wildly down Union Street, with shooters from 2 cars now firing at him. Higgins was hit multiple times. As Vannie collapsed onto Union Street, his grey fedora lay in the gutter and his light grey suit was quickly turning red from the blood splatter. With the assailants continuing firing at him and thinking his family was still in danger. Remarkably, Vannie rose to his feet and ran a short distance to 8th Avenue before staggering another 100 or so feet and then crawling to the protection of this stoop on 8th Avenue. The first person to reach Higgins was a cop on his payroll. "Who was it, Vannie?" the cop asked. "I'll get them," Vannie mumbled. "They tried to wipe out my whole family." "Who, Vannie?" again the officer asked, but Vannie fell unconscious. Another cop arrived shortly after and the pair carried Higgins to a cab, which took him to the Methodist Hospital. He had suffered 7 wounds to the abdomen, chest and left arm. Police tried to question him on his deathbed, as they had done after the stabbing at the Blossom Heath Inn. "I'll get them, the rats. They tried to kill my family. I'll get them," Vannie persisted. Vannie thought he was going to make it and pull through with this attempt on his life again, but he quickly began to deteriorate. By 1:40 a.m, with his wife Grace and his mother Helen at his side, Vannie had been administered the last rites by a Roman Catholic priest, but miraculously regained consciousness and tried to hold on. He slipped into a delirious state, and with a stenographer and 2 police officers by his side, Vannie began repeating, "I've gotta live, gotta get out of here, gotta straighten this out. They tried to wipe out my whole family." Higgins was given 3 blood transfusions, rallying after each one. However, the doctor realised it was a losing battle, and Vannie Higgins, the Bay Ridge hoodlum who conquered Brooklyn and afar, the suave, dangerous killer, the bootleg king of Long Island, died of his wounds at 3 p.m, around 15 hours after the shooting, aged 35. Vannie died sticking to the gangster code, never revealing the names of the perpetrators, although from his dying statements it seemed that he knew his attackers. Speculation was pointed towards Salvatore Spitale, an ex-member of Legs Diamond's gang who had been conned out of money by Legs and wanted to take out one of Diamond's closest friends for revenge. Spitale was questioned by police but had an alibi that checked out. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle called Vannie's death a crazy quilt of underworld feuds, explaining that it could have been any of Vannie's historical foes from Long Island or Manhattan. Another theory was that after Dutch Schultz had ended the gang war in Manhattan by putting over 15 bullets in Mad Dog Coll, Vannie was next on the Dutchman's hit list after the Manhattan bootleg wars when he sided with Legs Diamond. A third theory was that it was a hit ordered by the newly formed commission headed by Lucky Luciano, a former Arnold Rothstein protege, who wanted to wipe out any factions in New York that were not Italian and unite the whole of organised crime in the Big Apple under Italian rule. Whoever was behind the hit on Vannie certainly did their homework, knowing that the night he attended his daughter's tap dance recital was probably the only night of the year that he gave his numerous bodyguards a night off to keep the affair family orientated takes some knowledge. Knowledge that perhaps could have only been gathered from inside Higgins' clan. Perhaps Dutch Schultz had infiltrated the ranks once more as he had done with Bob Benson, or perhaps it was one of the other theories and they got lucky with Vannie not having any bodyguards that night. Either way, the bootlegging king of Long Island was laid to rest on June the 24th, 3 days after his death. There were over 700 people gathered to attend Vannie's funeral. A 20-car funeral cortege made its way through the Bay Ridge streets he played on as a young hoodlum and controlled as a man. Crowds gathered to see the star of Bay Ridge being drawn along by horses in his hearse. The 4th, 5th and 6th limousine following Vannie's hearse were all bulletproof and contained Vannie's pals from the underworld, including Bad Bill Bailey, Oni Madden and Big Bill Dwyer, to name a few. Vannie's funeral crowd was a who's who of the underworld, and thus over 40 of the 700 people gathered to catch a glimpse of the bootlegging king were detectives. Vannie's white gold casket was lowered into his final resting place at St. John's Cemetery, as all who knew him from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, Manhattan and Long Island lowered their heads. Just as Vannie was being lowered into his grave, a plane circled the funeral 3 times, just as it had for Bill Benson, and dropped a floral wreath on the procession, a tribute organised by Vannie's best friend, Bad Bill Bailey, who, unfortunately, would also be dead in less than 24 months. The Higgins gang disbanded shortly after Vannie's death, with Bad Bill earning his crust as a petty thief and street thug, apparently turning to the bottle after losing his status and his best friend in Vannie. Prohibition was repealed in 1933 and the beer halls, pubs and clubs reopened with legitimate suppliers, with the speakeasies closing and thus the need for bootleggers like Bad Bill. Lucky Luciano's commission took over the whole of organised crime in New York, splitting the 5 boroughs into 5 families after wiping out Vannie's rival Dutch Schultz and moving into Manhattan, where now the vice they were selling had been transitioned from booze to prostitution and dope, just as Lucky's boss Rothstein had pioneered. On December the 4th, 1934, Bad Bill Bailey, who'd been the chief lieutenant in the Higgins gang that terrorised Long Island in the 1920s and 1930s, had carried out a speculated 20 murders for Vannie, who had been involved in the murder of the pair's childhood friend and his own brother-in-law, succumbed to pneumonia, aged 35. Bad Bill was also given a speculative send-off by the residents of Bay Ridge. Thus brings an end to the remarkable life of Charles Vannie Higgins, a story that has somewhat been lost to time and a name that is just another footnote in the bloody history of the Prohibition era, but no doubt an interesting story, and one which I feel needs to be remembered, and hopefully one that I brought to life for you today. Thanks so much for watching. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.